This video is part 2 of Chapter 5, Memory, for PSY 110S, the Psychological Sciences. In the last section, we talked about the sensory registers and the short-term memory system. Now we're going to move on to talking about long-term memory. Long-term memory is where we store loads and loads of our own personal information, whether it's things you have tried to force yourself to remember or things that get remembered along the way. It doesn't really matter. That's where it lives. Long-term memory allows us to keep lots of information for long periods of time. In some cases, that information is permanently stored. In other cases, not so much. I took many years of French in high school and in college, and very little of that information is still with me. Nuggets, sure, but not a lot. Mostly because once I finished those classes, I really didn't have any opportunities to use that information, so it decayed over time. But there are lots of things that I remember without fail that happened very early in my life. So it has the potential for very long periods of duration, and the capacity is essentially unlimited. Now, there are tremendous individual differences in how easily people can put information into long-term memory and how easily they can pull information out of it. Some people are very gifted at encoding information and holding it, and also there are people who are very gifted at retrieval. So what we're going to talk about is what's typical in terms of memory. Long-term memory has a very large capacity, but it is not a literal recording of what we have seen or heard or experienced. What we do when we take information from the world, we have to operate on it, and essentially you're not talking about a physical machine where you're laying down memories. You can use the metaphor of the computer system for thinking about the human brain and how memory works, but it's really not a good representation of what we have to do because you are creating a biological system that represents these memories. So try and think back to your birthday when you were 10. Now, my guess is when you start searching for that, unless it was a particularly important event that happened that year, you're going to struggle hard to get to that memory with any degree of specificity. What you'll do instead is you'll probably produce a conglomerate of childhood birthday memories that are true enough. They're representative. So they may not be exact recordings. They have to be reconstituted so that you can talk about them or think about them. So long-term memories are essentially what's called reconstructive. When we dig back into our past, we have to collect information. That's easier if we have gone to that memory repeatedly. So if, say, there's a lot of family lore about a particular event and you have told the story many times, you're going to go back to that memory more easily than if I just out of the blue say, what were you doing on your birthday when you were 12? Then you're going to have to really think about it. Okay, 12. How many years ago was that? Where was I living? Was I in school? Was I not in school? These sorts of things. Was there a special birthday? Whatever. You're going to try and reconstruct what might have happened. Even with those well-worn memories that we use all the time, they are still reconstructive because if you think about as you age, who you are, what you've experienced is always changing. You're growing, you're developing, you're never quite the exact same person from one year to the next. So let's say I go to that well-worn memory from childhood, but now I'm in my 50s. The memory feels different. It has different meaning. I can interpret it differently. So I'm reconstructing my experience of that old memory in terms of who I am right now. And that's a kind of integrative function of memory that pulls it into the way we see ourselves, the way we understand ourselves. So it also has to connect with our current feelings, our current thoughts, and so on. So, like, just as a concrete example, if you take a person and you make them happy, so you tell them a bunch of funny jokes and you get them laughing, and then you have them talk about an old memory, the positive elements of that memory have a tendency to show up more than if you induce some sadness in that same person, tell them a sad story, and you get them in a sad state and have them recount that same memory. It tends to be shaded in the direction of the negative. So our current mood state, our current level of fatigue, as well as our personalities, our experiences in the given moment have an impact on how we recall previous events. There are a couple of broad categories of long-term memory. One of these is called explicit or declarative memory, and this is memory that you have to consciously work at pulling up and recalling. So when I ask you, tell me about your 10th birthday, you're going to have to go to episodic memory to look at that personal experience. And then if I asked you who was the 5th president of the United States, that's semantic memory, where you had put that information, and no, I don't know who it was, because I haven't learned that since I was in grade school. So, but that's semantic memory. If you ask me, and here's one of these arcane pieces of information that's completely useless to me, who was the first horse to win the Kentucky Derby? And it was a horse named Sir Barton in 1919. For whatever reason, that is stuck in my semantic memory since my years as a 4-H'er, learning all that information about horses. Anyway, the other side of long-term memory is implicit memory, also called non-declarative. And this is memory that doesn't require attention or intention to be recalled. So some things that we are classically conditioned to, the easiest to identify are like fear responses. For instance, a particular smell or a particular visual input, a particular sensation on the skin can trigger a recollection of something we've experienced in the past, especially if it was particularly fear-inducing, or on the more positive side, if it was sexually arousing, if it was funny, then that's implicit memory that's stored there and triggers that emotional response. There's also procedural memory. So this is where you learn a skill that is at first very effortful, but over time becomes automatic. For example, I valiantly tried to learn how to play piano, but I had difficulty getting my two hands to do two different things at the same time. Very frustrating. I got to a level of competency before I maxed out to kind of know where the fingerings for, say, from middle C across one hand, what those fingerings would feel like, and they became pretty automatic, like playing row, row, row your boat was just really not hard. Very easy. Another example, when I was in high school and in college, I ran track and I ran hurdles. When I was learning how to hurdle as a 7th grader, it was very effortful, but over time, my body acquired these procedural recollections of what to do, and it became very, very automatic. So that kind of motor skill, cognitive skill. In the video that I posted in the module for this chapter, the story of Clive Waring, whose ability to form new memories was wiped out by a viral infection. he still had intact procedural memory of how to play piano, play organ, flawlessly. So all of those memories were stored in a different location than where his brain was damaged. So he was still able to do those things. But if you asked him, later after he's done playing, were you just playing the piano? He would say, no, I have no memory of doing that. And he would be accurate because he has no capacity to form any new memories of episodes. So his new episodic memory is gone, but he has intact procedural memory. And then there's the influence of priming, which, remember how I mentioned earlier that, if we make someone sad, it can shape the way their recollection of an event is described. Priming can influence the process of putting things into implicit memory, but also how we respond to them later. So, we prime someone with sadness, they may remember a story as being significantly more sad. If we prime them with happiness, they may remember that experience with more happiness, and so on. Now, amnesia, which is, it's always a tricky topic because there's so much folklore and misinformation out there in popular culture about what amnesia is and how it happens. If you went by popular culture, amnesia for personal identity is happening all the time after a simple bump on the head. No, that's really not what happens. Amnesia comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes, but we have research on very distinctive case studies, like the story of H.M., who experienced severe what's called anterograde amnesia. So what he had was a complete inability to form long-term memories for events after he had brain surgery. There's also something called retrograde amnesia, and this is an inability to remember events before a trauma, a surgery or injury to the brain. Now, HM in particular, he had his hippocampus and part of the surrounding temporal lobe removed due to a seizure disorder. He was in his 20s when this occurred. Before he had the operation, his long and short-term memory systems were normal. After the operation, he couldn't store any new long-term memories. His short-term memory was still relatively intact, but he couldn't encode any new information. So what that means is he had anterograde amnesia, the inability to form long-term memories afterwards. What was also noted in HM's case was that he did not experience retrograde amnesias. So he did have some difficulties, but not very many in that area. So his primary losses were in the form of anterograde amnesia. His short-term memory was pretty much unimpaired. Implicit repetition involves testing how people with amnesia can show the response to priming. So if you look at this task, and I'm going to show you a little video because it's hard to explain the task without kind of seeing it. So I'm going to play this video and then we'll talk about it some more.
We began this lesson by talking about Henry Molaison. One thing we didn't discuss about HM was a task they had him engage in. In this task, neural psychologist Brenda Milner, who was working with HM, had him perform a mirror tracing task like this one. HM was to trace within 2 lines of the star while viewing it only through a mirror, which was the reverse image. So if his hand moved one way, the hand in the mirror moved the other. They asked HM to perform this task up to 10 times each day for 3 days. They counted the errors each time he went outside of the lines. What's interesting is that HM's drawings improved, even though he couldn't recall having done this task before. Now you're looking at the times that I tried it, and I'll be honest, this task was really hard to do. So what does this tell us about the brain? HM didn't remember engaging in this task, but he visibly improved. Well, it turns out that he couldn't form new explicit long-term memories due to damage to his hippocampus and surrounding areas. But he could learn new skills, as was demonstrated by his performance on this task.
So that shows the difference between the procedural memories that he was still capable of learning. He could learn to do new tasks, and he showed improvement in those tasks despite having no memory of having done them. So he improved from session to session over time. The mirror tracing task, basically what that enables researchers to do is to show that distinction between an episodic memory and a procedural memory. So what that suggests is that the areas of the brain that were removed in HM, or Henry Molaison, in the temporal lobe and in the hippocampus, procedural memories are basically housed in other areas of the brain, but they require integration in the frontal temporal lobes in order for us to record the fact that we have learned them. We can demonstrate them, but we don't have the information to understand what we have in fact learned. Now, it's understood that for infants and children, and I've often been uncomfortable calling this amnesia, but I guess, what other better word would there be? Infants and small children typically do not have capacity or cognitive skill or brain development to record detailed episodic memories that are woven into the fabric of their experience. So, infants and small children, they're pretty immediate in terms of their experience of themselves and of the world. One argument has been, and there's empirical evidence to support this, that the cerebellum at the base of the brain is important for forming implicit memories. And during infancy, there's a lot of growth of new cells, new neurons. So that's called neurogenesis, as well as a lot of development of new connections. So laying down new connections between neurons, taking away ones that aren't useful, but lots of new development. During that time period also in infancy, the hippocampus is still growing and developing. So the fact that the hippocampus isn't fully cooked yet means that it's difficult for infants and small children to lay down these elaborate long-term memories. So it's also been argued that this high level of neurogenesis, where you're constantly, forgive the metaphor, rewiring the brain as it grows and develops, it may interfere with the ability of the hippocampus to do what it later will do all the time, which is create new memories and weave them into the fabric of existing information already stored in memory. Now, little kids, they don't have a lot of past information that's accessible to them. So they may form some implicit memories, but they're going to be short on episodic and semantic memories because just their level of brain development may actually interfere and allow those memories to degrade. So this explains why for most, the overwhelming majority of people, that adults cannot recall information prior to the age of 3. Now, many people argue strenuously that they remember details from infancy and toddlerhood. But what usually is happening there is that other people have supplied you with stories of your early life, of your infancy, of your toddlerhood, and they have shown you pictures, they have shown you videos. And what's happened is that when you're older, you have stored those stories and images in your mind, and it feels like it's a real memory when in fact it's not. It's stories that you were told later about that earlier point in time. From a biological standpoint, it's incredibly unlikely that you recall anything prior to the age of 3. Now, the distinction between short and long-term memory, it may surprise you, but there's often been debate about exactly what is the borderline between short-term and long-term. Where do we place that borderline? Is there really a hard and fast border between the two? And the task that's often used in order to kind of look at the short-term, long-term distinction is something called a free recall task. And what you do in this experimental procedure is you give participants a list of words that typically are unrelated to one another, and you ask them to recall them in whatever order they like. So let's say I give you a list of 20 words, and I read them out to you, and then I ask you immediately to recall them. It's called free recall because you're allowed to do it in any order you want. What tends to happen is that there will be a primacy effect. So compared to the middle of the list, the first 5 items on that list will be easier to recall than the next 5 items on the list. The primacy effect is due to the fact that those first 5, because what we tend to do, you're given a list of words, as the person reading them to you is reading them out, you are rehearsing the first 5 until there gets to be too much interference. Once you get to item 6 on that list of 15, it becomes harder and harder for you to rehearse. You don't have time to rehearse all of the words before the person reading them is getting to the next one. So you've drilled on the first 5 enough that there's a primacy effect, and you're going to get those ones right. Now, there's also what's called a recency effect. And that recency effect is that compared to the middle of the list, we recall the last 5. If you have a 15-item list, the last 5 items will be easier to recall than the middle 5 because they're still kind of hanging out in short-term memory. So the primacy effect is due to encoding, due to rehearsal, the words getting into a fairly fragile state in long-term memory, and then the last 5 items are still in that short-term memory space for you to recall. As this graphic shows, the zone of premium remembering is that area from the beginning of the list. The zone of very recent things is at the end of the list, and the zone of is in the middle. So those middle words, what's happening to those is a lot of interference. So in the middle, what's causing interference is the fact that you're still rehearsing the first 5 items on the list. What's interfering also, though, is being exposed to the last 5 items on the list, because you have no chance of rehearsing any of those middle of the list items. This is called the serial position effect, and this is a less humorous graphical representation of how primacy and recency work. So it depends on the serial position of the item in the list. So in this case, in this image, you have 20 items, and you'll notice superior recall for the first item, slowly declining as you get to the 5th, then plateauing from the 5th to the 15th, and then really good recall, climbing as you get to the very last items on the list. So how do we get information into long-term memory? And that's a process called encoding. Encoding involves transferring information, moving it from one stage of memory to another. So you have to move it from sensory memory to short-term memory, from short-term memory to long-term memory. And depending on the type of memory that you're talking about, whether it's implicit or explicit, that requires either greater or less intentionality and energy and effort and attention. If you're talking about studying for declarative memory, like you have to learn a list of information, you have to learn a pack of definitions or something like that, you have to very intentionally drill that information, test and retest yourself to get that information from the sensory memory to the short-term memory and into the long-term. With implicit memory, there's some different avenues, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. The word storage refers to how we keep the information within a particular stage. So if you're talking about iconic memory and you're looking at something, say I'm looking at a license plate, I'm trying to take in that visual information. If I'm really wanting to keep it around, I'm going to study it, examine it, look at the information. Then if I'm wanting to move it to short-term memory, I can give it a little bit of meaning, noticing what are the letters, what are the numbers, is it a vanity plate, is there a way I can create sounds with this? By manipulating it in that space of short-term memory, I'm keeping it alive temporarily until I can add any additional meaning to it that can keep it and hold it in long-term storage. So there's storage at each level of memory. What varies is capacity and duration. Retrieval is the process of getting stuff back out. And that can sometimes be really, really devilishly hard and other times really easy. Like Sir Barton, 1919, I don't know why. I don't even know if it's right, but boy, is it stuck in my head. But ask me to name the fifth president, nope. Way too long, haven't used it as much. So how do we do this encoding job? It really is one of the most important things that we do in our mental lives is remember stuff. So how does encoding happen? In some cases, what we're doing is very, very effortful. So if I give you a bunch of vocabulary words and I ask you to memorize them, you're going to study. You're going to have to read the words, read the definitions, read the words, read the definitions, read them over and over, then test yourself. That's effortful processing. If you are dealing with a ton of information, you might want to chunk it. You might want to create categories. You might want to weave it into previous experiences and understandings. All of that is effortful. There's also a type of processing that's automatic. So if I'm looking at a license tag, I automatically know that some of the things on that tag are numbers, some are letters. That's automatically processed. Doesn't require attention. Since I can read, I know how to read, I know how to recognize the difference between numbers and letters. If it is a vanity tag, it will in some way represent words that have meaning. And if it's a language you're fluent in, you're going to automatically process that language. So some processing is fairly automatic and doesn't require any effort on our part to encode. If you want processing to become automatic, you have to practice and practice and practice. And therefore, like with language learning, for little kids that don't read yet, or are just learning their letters, they're just learning to sound out words, it's very, very effortful for them to say the words and remember the words. For people who've been reading and using language for a long time, processing language is pretty much automatic It requires very little attention. And in fact, it's super hard to turn off, which there's some examples that we could use of how we can be tricked by. It's why proofreading is so hard. You write something, you write a paper, and then you're reading along and you don't notice little tiny misspellings or missing words even, because your brain kind of fills in the gaps. That's a kind of automatic processing. So I've been using the example of reading. At first, reading is totally effortful, but after you practice for years and years, it becomes easier, more automatic. Now, in the case of people with reading disabilities, like dyslexia, for example, that automaticity never really is achieved, and reading remains quite effortful because of perceptual difficulties and other kinds of cognitive deficits that may be present. So that's another way of thinking about this process of moving from effortful to automatic processing. And that concludes part 2 of Chapter 5.